Today, I'm going to get to see a very, very important mountain bike. In fact, it was likely that it's the first iteration of a mountain bike to make its way to Europe. It got here in 1977. It was built in 1976 by Gary Fisher. And I'm going to get to have a go on this bike and check it out. Wait for this, retro gold coming up. I used to read all the stories about how a bunch of hippies in Northern California were busy turning old 1940s beach cruisers into clunkers, racing them down the sides of mountain passes, inventing technically what we now know as mountain biking. And I used to read all the books, like this one, written by Nicky Crowther, who in fact raced for my local bike shop, which was weirdly owned by one of my maths teachers. And I used to watch all of the VHS cassettes because there was no YouTube back then, there was no DVDs back then. VHS videos, baby. And this one, totally wild, featured a bunch of pro riders, including silver medalist Dave Hemming in here. But amongst these riders was a chap called Jay Hardy.
Hi, I'm Jay and I do jumps. One of the greatest joys in mountain biking is to descend fast.
Now Jay was a BMX racer, you could see it the way he rode a bike. Apparently he was amazing at BMX racing back in the day and transferred his skills over into mountain biking, where he was sponsored by Trek and was a test rider for Mountain Biker International magazine, another magazine that I bought religiously every month. So imagine the surprise I got recently when Jay Hardy rang me up and told me that he watches GMBN Tech. He likes the show, he likes what we talk about, and he had a bike that said was really important and we must see it at once. So as Jay started elaborating a bit on the bike, he asked me if I'd heard of a writer called Richard Grant. And you know what? I had. I couldn't place it, so I started looking through my old books, and there we go. One of the books, Richard's Ultimate Bicycle Book. I got this one for Christmas in 1994. Studied it cover to cover, just like I did with everything. So I was like, yeah, I know Richard Grant. He also wrote a book called Richard's Mountain Bike Book, which is this one right here. So I got to work studying the book, and in fact, in this book, he references directly the bike I'm about to check out. Now check this out, I'm going to read you a little paragraph from here. They love the challenge of turning someone new onto off-road riding. After 2 hours hurtling around the Marin Hills, shooting down fire roads, I was sold. It was the most fun I'd ever had on a bike. Did I want one? Gary had devised 20 or so clunkers out of cannibalised old Schwinn Excelsior frames. Go on, take one back to England, just 275 bucks. 2 days later, I collected my very own clunker. I was a convert. Even then, Gary and Charlie knew they were onto something. They were the freewheeling alchemists of a very 60s type dream. Now that really is the start of where this story begins, and I'm off to meet Jay right now with that bike from 1976. I cannot believe it. It feels like my career has gone full circle. Incredible. Okay, so this is the actual bike. First I can't believe the condition of it, but I guess the more pressing question is, how on earth have you got hold of this bike?
By accident. I'd known Richard Grant, who owned it, who Gary built it for in '77 since 1980. And I knew he had a mountain bike, and I remember seeing this mountain bike in the Action Bike offices, which was the BMX magazine he ran. And we talked over the years about me buying his bike from him. And then it got to the point where Richard was ready to sell the bike, so he sent me some pictures, and it's like, that's not the bike. And it turns out the bike I remember is an original Ritchie, was stolen in the late 80s. And this is the bike that Richard was talking about, which isn't the bike I thought I was buying.
Massively predates it.
Yeah. So
right in front of me here is, give or take, a 1977 clunker. Now this, you could say, is like the forerunner for the modern mountain bike. This is really where it all started. Now, there's lots of different stories floating around online about where mountain biking started, but of course the story we know so well started and originated in Northern California with a bunch of hippies who were basically having fun on the side of a mountain, turning old paperboy style beach cruiser bikes into things like this, with almost completely inappropriate gear on there. But over the years, they started refining these bikes and turning them into what we now know as mountain bikes. Now, the earliest iterations of these would have had a single speed setup with a coaster brake. Now, I've ridden down Repack with Neil previously, and I can tell you, you wouldn't want to go down on a bike with 2 brakes like this, let alone on a bike with just a single coaster brake on the rear. It just seems absolutely crazy. But the cool thing about Repack, it actually took its name from those rear coaster brake hubs. Apparently they used to be almost smoking by the time they got to the bottom of the hill, and I had to constantly repack them with grease in order to keep those brakes working. And then of course, afterwards they started moving on to slightly better things. Bit by bit they started breaking things and working out that different things weren't fit for purpose. And this is where this bike steps in. Okay, so Richard Grant, he's a writer. I know him as a cycling writer because I've got a couple of his books from when I was younger. Recognise the name. What's your relationship with Richard?
I was a BMX racer as a kid, and then I started riding for the magazine, test riding for the magazine. Then I got involved with the events. We did the Pickett's Lock events in 1983, which was the first indoor BMX event in the country. Shortly after that, we did the NEC event. That led into the Kellogg series for Channel 4, which we did 2 series of, which of course got me interested in events.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how the whole Malverns thing and all that happened. So it all led into each other.
So a bit about Jay's background. Obviously, I've grown up in a mountain biking era, so seeing this bike is just outstanding for me. But even actually, to be fair, chatting to you, Jay, because what you might not realise was I was always that little kid that was at the races, getting the t-shirt signed and doing that stuff. You know, I read all the books, I read all the magazines, read MBUK from issue number 1. I've got them all, given to me by my dad's friend he used to play badminton with. He's like, you should read this, you'll probably like this. And of course, seeing you in Totally Wild, doing some crazy stuff with Rob Warner and many riders. So you've been on the scene a long time, so this actually must be, I mean, other than State in the Office, must be a pretty special bike to own this.
I didn't realise what I was buying, because obviously I bought the bike. I bought the bike because Richard is my mentor in a lot of ways. And I wanted to own Richard's bike. I didn't want anybody else to own his bike. And then when I bought the bike and started finding out and contacted Charlie and spoke to Gary by email and all that kind of stuff, it slowly started coming out that this wasn't just any old clunker, that they were of the opinion that it was definitely the first one in the UK, probably the first mountain bike in Europe. And as it's turned out, it's beginning to look a bit like Richard exported from America the first mountain bike that ever left America.
In fact, Gary only built maybe half a dozen clunkers for other people, but you know, it's not like there was money in it. It was just like, how do you get your friends on a bike, you know?
Richard Grant, oh my God. He showed up, you know, and he was into the scene, and I was like, at that period of time, I was making bikes for my friend. Thanks. And the bike that I put together with him, it's like that bike that I saw in the photo. God, that's the bike.
So let's go back to the beginning. So this is a clunker, what we know is like the sort of predecessor to the mountain bike, which at some point would have been some kind of beach cruiser style bike with like a fairing, like motorcycle fairing and mudguards and stuff. And the early adopters, you know, which were Gary Fisher, Charlie Kelly, Joe Breeze, and all of the sort of the Marin County crew, were basically customising their bikes like this so they could ride them down hills and have fun on. But that was kind of a North California thing. I'm aware that there were similar scenes going on around the world. Glenn Jacobs has told me of an Australian one. There was a Canadian one going on. All similar sort of times, people figuring this stuff out.
We were far from the first to do this. I mean, there were other enclaves of people who had discovered old bikes and riding on dirt roads. We were not the first to do that, but I definitely invented the timed downhill, you know, the downhill time trial. And the downhill time trial is what really kicked, well, it gave people a reason to want the bike to be more than just, you know, something I could ride down the hill.
But how on earth did Richard get hold of this bike? Because that was like a pretty closed scene at the time.
Yeah, Richard started off as a journalist, and he was working for the National Enquirer in the States. And he'd heard about these guys in Northern California doing this clunking thing. Went out to Northern California to kind of find out what's going on. met up with Charlie and Gary. They dragged him up the mountain and went, come riding with us. And, you know, he launched himself down the mountain, not as much of a rider at all. So you and I both know, launching yourself down that mountain on something like this. So for a guy that didn't ride, and he you know, loved it, went back to Gary's house, had a chat, and Gary said, well, buy a bike. So he did. Richard
came over and London Times, holy shit, let's do something, you know, I get you a bike, let's go. You know, I got it because it was my thing the whole time. It's like, I want to see this thing spread.
And so this bike, from what you've sent me and from what I've read, it appeared to buy this for like, I think it was under $300 at the time, which would have been a lot of money back then for a bike that was kind of a bespoke bike built by Gary Fisher. It just seems crazy to me that we've not heard about this bike sooner, because we've seen, you know, lots of other sort of US-based bikes have made it over to the UK and that, but essentially this was a forerunner for the mountain bike.
Yeah.
This before the brand mountain bike and before we know, you know, as what we know now as mountain bikes.
I mean, talking to Richard, he bought the bike, came back to the UK, rode the bike around for a while, and then, as you well know from your research, you know, the Ritchie and all those kind of, as it were, variants of modernisation came along, and Richard bought one of the first Ritchies. So he literally was riding that around. This was then the other bike.
Just put to the back seat, I guess, yeah.
And then this bike didn't see the light of day until it was in the Science Museum in London in 1993. And since then, it's basically lived in Richard's basement.
So there's a few particularly cool things about this that I've noticed since I've been here. So one of them is the head tube badge, and the second one is the paint job. So I've been to the museum in Marin County, and they've got loads of old Schwinn DX Elisas, and they've got the original paint, which is sort of cream and blood red sort of look
sort
to
of
it.
Darkish red, yeah.
Yeah, and all the pictures I've seen in Charlie Kelly's book, which, by the way, is an absolute essential read for anyone. He's riding bikes that look exactly like this, but they're painted and not like this. But from what I've read in the books, that head tube badge was something that almost exclusively Gary and Charlie and a very small crew of them used to put on their own personal bikes.
No proof. The suspicion is from, like you say, things like the sticker, the paint job, that this was a bike that was used because when Richard agreed to buy the bike, the finished bike was ready 2 days later. So Charlie, in one of his...
half ready.
Yeah, well, it would seem that the originality of this bike was 76-ish, and that it was completed or rebuilt slightly for Richard.
Yeah, so I've spoken to Gary quite a lot about these early bikes, and it did sound like there was almost a bit of a drought of the frames, because let's face it, they weren't designed for mountain biking. Some of them date back to like 1940, I think. All these Schwinn frames, they pretty much got all of them they could get their hands on, and would start, you know, each build would be slightly different. They'd all have like the Brook saddles and the big moto style bars, different brake levers. I think Gary favoured, or one of them favoured using the Magura levers, because when they bent in crashes, they were the ones that they could bend back, they wouldn't snap, and all this stuff. So it sounded like they had a fleet of these bikes that weren't quite finished, and anytime they'd get some new parts in on the bike, next one's ready to go.
Yeah,
Get out the door.
I get the impression they just got on with Richard and liked Richard and went, do you know what, have one.
And everything I know about Gary as well, and think the stories he's told me about how, you know, there's other people that have done this, but he really did help put mountain bike on the map. Giving that bike to Richard, I mean, it's taken a while for this story to come out, but getting the right people on the bike no doubt would have made other people notice what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the sort of history shows, you know, Richard was a journalist, and then from his interest in mountain bikes that spawned from that meeting, Richard's book of bicycles and all of those things, Richard ended up owning and editing BMX Action Bike magazine throughout the 80s. So there's a lot of cycle journalistic kind of roots and history that actually come out of that meeting to buy this bike.
I love it. I don't think I've been as interested in a single bike for such a long time. The amount of reading and research I've done over the last few days to just try and get my head around why this bike has not seen daylight sooner. I'm stoked to see it. Thank you so much for telling me about it and bringing the bike out. I want to take a closer look at the bike and just have a look at all the details on this and take this in. So if you picture back to the early 1940s and you imagine what this might have looked like, it would have had big chrome mudguards on there, trying to look something, I guess, like a hot rod style bike with a fake petrol can on the top. Having that vision to turn those into these, I'm just staggered by. So the frame itself was based around a Schwinn 1940 Excelsior, but there's something quite different about this one. If you look closely, you can see almost bits of red escaping through here. So the early models of this that I've seen in the Marin Museum of Mountain Biking had a red and beige or red and white kind of paint job on this. So this one obviously has been hand painted, and it bears a graphic on the top tube there. It looks like a bit like the Harley Davidson style live to ride, ride to live logo. Now, I've heard stories that Charlie Kelly and some of the other clunkers sprayed bikes up like this for themselves. So there's a good chance this bike could have been one of the personal bikes before it's ended up here in the UK. I'm just blown away to see this thing in the flesh. It's just a piece of mountain biking history and kind of completes my story in mountain biking actually for myself on a purely selfish thing. I'm just staggered to see it in the flesh. Okay, so up to the front end of the bike, and although it is clearly quite old, it doesn't look that old. The big wide bar, so it's 700mm and it's a 60mm stem. So you think about those numbers, you think how old the bike is. Somewhere in the middle, mountain biking got a bit lost and a bit confused. We'll pick that up in a different video. But I just want to illustrate the fact that this was all about trying to get the ultimate and the optimum handling for what they were trying to do on these bikes. Big handlebars with all the leverage, trying to get the weight behind that steerer tube, trying to get the weight in the right place on the front wheel, trying to keep the weight on the rear wheel for the braking. Everything about the bike actually makes sense. Again, head angle around 68 degrees. Can't confirm that on this model, but it was give or take, depending on how long the model of fork was that was used. And then the brake levers, of course. Big old motorcycle brake levers. You can see they've got the threaded inserts on them, presumably for the mirrors to go on. And there were loads of different options of brake levers. This one actually has 2 different ones, so guessing at some point someone crashed this bike or crashed a set of brake levers, broke one, so there's not quite a pair on there. And even the thumb shifters themselves. So they're 2 right-hand shifters here, so this one actually shifts backwards. Now, I am wondering if these predated original thumb shifters, and they might actually be stem shifters from a road bike, which I read that they did use on some of the earlier bikes. As we know, these bikes were an amalgamation of different parts, some parts from motorcycles, some from road bikes, as we see with the cranks, and of course from the BMX world as well. As you can see with the established stem and the fork on here, just look at the profile on this. So unlike tubular steel forks, this essentially is just solid steel. To me, it looks terrifying, but imagine actually they're probably pretty strong. You
look at that fork, it's got an Ashtabula fork on it. They're funky. They look funky, you know, but they actually worked, you know, like they didn't bend. It was used good materials in them and everything.
So now I'm just down at the back of the bike looking at the transmission here. And actually the first thing I notice is how good that chain line is on there, which just seems crazy given that this bike originally wouldn't have even had gears on there at all. So don't forget that these things they were customized, you know, they were a butchery of things, an amalgamation to get to what this is. So you can see where the mech hanger is quite crudely bolted onto the frame here. You've got a Suntour derailleur on the back, 5-speed. You've got a Simplex derailleur on the front with a 2-speed setup there. And like I say, like actually a really good chain line with plenty of space. Don't get me wrong, the tyres aren't exactly huge, but there's not a bad amount of space on the bike. Now gearing appears to be, what, a 1430, I think you said on the rear. So it even goes to show that they were thinking about the climbing gears back in these days. And on the front, it's a 42 and a 52. So actually quite huge gearing for getting back down the hill again. It's just fascinating to see. I'm blown away by it. And if you look closely at the rear derailleur here, look at the cage. You can actually remove the chain from this without having to split the chain. Why don't we have that feature anymore? So the hubs then. So as I said, in the early days, well, this was from the early days, but the earlier days of the clunker bikes, they didn't have a front brake, they had a coaster brake on the rear, but as they found out the brakes would fade and there'd be handling trait problems, not being able to sort of load the front end of the bike, having to pedal backwards to brake. In the search for better braking, they looked to hub gears. So there was Union, there was Schwinn hubs, Workman, which I think was some kind of tricycle hub brake. And then these ones, of course, which is Sturmey Archer, a bit more familiar to us in the UK. amazing condition on these. And Jay's kindly offered to let me have a little spin on this bike in a minute, which I'm kind of mildly terrified about, but I have to take the opportunity just to see how these felt and just to put myself in a situation of what it must have been like to ride these bikes back in the day. All fascinating stuff. Feel pretty privileged actually to just be next to this bike. So the wheels on here have got 40mm wide rims on there. They're steel rims. Now, something Gary Fisher has told me about these early rims were the fact that they were quite weak made them actually quite a good thing. So the rim itself was quite deformable. So when, not if, when they dented them on rocks and stuff as they were out riding, they wouldn't get pinch punches because of the fact that the rim was actually so deformable and malleable. They'd just literally bend them back with a pair of pliers or whatever they could get their hands on and carry on riding. But the problem with these steel wheels were they actually weighed a small, probably had their own gravitational pull. They were so heavy. And of course, when they later put cantilever brakes on the bikes, the braking just would have been frankly awful on the steel rims there. So it was much later on that alloy rims started coming in as part of modern technology as we know it. And you probably noticed they're 26-inch as well. So this is where the 26-inch wheel thing came from mountain biking. It wasn't necessarily decided that it was the best wheel size, but the technology was already there. You could already buy rims, you could already get spokes in the correct length, and you could get tyres that were pretty much good enough for the job. Now the tyres on this bike are not originals, but we have got one of the originals here to show you. Now, other than the fact that the handlebar grips have been changed for something as near to, because they had perished, the tyres are the only other thing that are not standard on this bike. The rest is completely standard. However, Jay still has the tyres that were on the bike from, I was going to say from new, but when the bike was acquired. So they're Uniroyal knobby tyres. So the classic tyre that I've read about, they were used by all of the clunkers because they were universally available. Actually, looking at the tread on it, it's not too bad. They've got a half decent shoulder on them. And as I say, it was rumoured that Gary Fisher would actually take to his tyres to not only improve the grip by removing some of the knobbles, but actually weigh what he took off the tyres as well in order to take some of the weight out of them, because it's not exactly on the light side.
The tire we used was a Uniroyal tire, the big knobby. And I actually would cut them with an X-Acto knife, and it was a real pain in the ass, And I'd take it and weigh the whole pile. I'd take a couple of ounces out of the tire because those things are super heavy.
As you can see, this tyre here is quite perished, so just not suitable to stay on the bike any longer. But pretty cool to know that this tyre will have been down repack at some point. And I guess the last thing to comment on is the saddle, which appears to be a Brooks, I'd guess a B52 saddle here. So proper cowhide top on there. You've got adjustable tension here that you can see at the front, and you've got the rails at the back here. You can actually adjust the angle of the actual saddle. Now, you know anything about bikes, I'm sure you probably would have heard of Brooks, the British saddle company. Highly sought after around the world, always have been. But apparently when these were being spec'd on the clunkers, they were just cheap and fairly easy to get hold of, which, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool having a British saddle on a US bike that's back here in Britain. Smooth actually, isn't it? Okay, so the brakes are pretty crazy, aren't they? The handlebar position is bizarre. I don't even care that I just rode down literally a straight bit of trail. That's not even on a trail. The brakes don't work, but I'm just buzzing because of what this bike is. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing for a job and what I do for my pastime if it wasn't for bikes like this. Like, that's full circle, it's nuts. End of, there's nothing else to say. I'm buzzing, I love it, absolutely love it. Obviously the brakes are the wrong way around, the back brake doesn't really do anything at all, so you just got to take it easy anyway, let alone the fact it's so old, so got to sort of appreciate it for what it is. The bar position it kind of makes sense, if you're out the saddle you're attacking, going down a fire road at speed, but it feels so alien, you need to spend a bit of time to sort of dial into this. Front brake, bizarrely quite powerful. It didn't really do anything when I first rode it, but now it's really starting to bite, so I suggest they probably work a bit better when there's friction, a bit more heat in there. The geometry doesn't feel bad. Turns out those guys kind of knew what they were doing back then. Who'd have thought it? I'm sure there were some skeptical people when they were doing this back in the 70s, but look where we are today. All thanks to bikes like this. And that's pretty much everything I can comment on this unreal bike. It's not often I'm pretty speechless talking about bikes, but I'm looking at a piece of mountain bike history here. It really is incredible to see this here in the UK as well, which is, I guess this is really the first proper form of mountain bike in the UK. This is where mountain bikes stemmed from, and this is almost certainly the first one that made its way, or possibly the only one that made its way over here. And I must say a huge thank you to Jay for bringing the bike here to Swinley Forest for us to see, but an even bigger thank you to Richard Grant for essentially making this happen. I always love reading your books, Richard, but I've got to say, I prefer your bike. I think this is just incredible. I'd love to know what you think of this bike, what you think of the story behind this. Now, I'm almost certain there's going to be a few more videos popping up with this, and I've got a couple of great ideas. So let us know what you think in the comments underneath, and we'll see you in the next video. See you later.